Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the study again. Now, in this lecture 5, we'll discuss the relationship between the leader's morality and the boom and bust of the society. If you have followed this course so far, I think our viewers would not be surprised about the concept of leader-country relationship. In traditional Chinese culture, right, the leader is not just a powerful individual with, boxes to tick, finishes his to-do list and job well done. The leader's personality and ethical characteristics have long been recognized as having a profound impact on people's life and the direction of the society. So this warrants a dedicated lecture for us to shed more light on this issue and really understand the mechanism behind such relation. Okay? Now, speaking of boom and bust of the society, I think the human society provides a natural database, if you like, for us to investigate the drivers behind such cycle. From the study of history, we can test various governance styles and understand what works and what doesn't work. In particular, the Chinese history provides a unique testing ground for this purpose. This is because the Chinese civilization is one of the very few that exists continuously for the last 5,000 years. Therefore, the ancient governing principles are based on the result of continuous testing during such a long period of time. In modern science term, the governing principle can be treated as a book of empirical study of the boom and bust of the society. Okay, so this is what makes the study of the governing principles very useful, I suppose. Now, among all of the recommendations and, experiences, the morality of the leader is one of the most frequently discussed governing principles. In volume 45, for example, of the governing principles, there is an interesting description of the evolution of social development with respect to the change in the leader's mentality. So it starts by assuming a prosperous society. Okay, a prosperous society. Now, in this society, from the top there, people have been enjoying stability, peace, and material enrichment. Although the modern world is not a peaceful one with regional wars and conflict, we can still find certain parts of the world which have enjoyed decades of stability and prosperity, right? Now, the governing principle point out that as the leader has inherited such stability for a long time, he becomes somehow incapable of detecting any deterioration of social ethics. The leader gradually falls into a state of mind that he takes enrichment as a given fact. So consequently, when the governance starts to lose effectiveness, the leader simply cannot see the necessity of change or reform. And even after social chaos have changed from sporadic events to some kind of normality, the leader still cannot see it because he has gotten used to it. If you remember from lecture 3, we said that the government has now lost its sense of vigilance. So what does the leader do? Well, the leader may indulge in a comfortable lifestyle and find it difficult to listen to any of the advice. Because the virtuous ministers and officials can see the problem and give tough advice to the leader may find it unpleasant to have virtuous ministers around him. So these ministers and officials may simply be ignored. And what replace them are treacherous people who can fulfill the leader's vanity, really. According to countless historic episodes, this is the sign of the fall of the country and the rise of chaos. Now, if we think about it, the root cause of such turmoil is the bad characteristics of the leader. Now, this doesn't always have to be one single individual, right? It can be a group of leading figures. So they have similar mentality or atmosphere. Now, we're going to closely examine just how the leader's morality can change the society. And we'll divide the teaching of the governing principles in this area into 3 dimensions based on the leader's attitude, namely attitudes towards the people, the attitude towards self-cultivation, and finally, the attitude towards government human resource management, or resource policy. Okay, so first of all, the different attitudes towards the people. Now, the governing principles make it very clear and explicit that there is a causal effect from the leader's attitude about the people to the governing outcome. Now, if you look at the earlier periods of Chinese history, for example, the Xia dynasty, the Shang dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, each thrived for many generations, but the Qin dynasty only lived for 2 generations, father and son, really, and ended only with the second emperor. Now, one of the reasons is that most of the rulers during the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties were able to share the concerns of the people. We call it the leader and the people go through foul and fair. In a thriving society, we can often observe that the leader's happiness and worries change with the people. When the people show sign of concern over certain issues, the government would form a working group, right, to work out how to address the issue. Even if the solution is not a perfect one, the direction of the effort is consistent. Meanwhile, the government used the happiness of the people as the benchmark of the performance. So, based on the governing principle, the measurement of government performance does not rely only on certain economic measures or statistics. The government's performance is measured against how it has managed to solve the people's problem. And this includes their livelihood, safety, healthcare, and so on. So just exactly what went wrong with Qin dynasty then? Well, Qin dynasty was the first dynasty of Chinese history when China is presented as a unified country. Okay, during the Warring State period, or at the end of it, the state of Qin ended the many years of war among independent states through its superior military power. If you look at the archaeological relics of the various weaponries of Qin, they're far more advanced than other states during this time. And we must say that, the emperor of Qin was a talented person. Well, he must be, right? And he had made many contributions. For example, he unified writings, he standardized measurements, which had very positive effect on preserving the history and culture. However, after the unification, the government didn't make much effort in solving people's problem. And quite the contrary, it created problems. And most notably, the Qing government oppressed the people to an extreme. To borrow the word from the governing principles, the emperor didn't share happiness with the people and certainly did not share people's concern. So for this reason, despite of Qing family's enormous military power and authority, the government was overthrown and nobody came for the rescue. Now, but we must now dig deeper into the mentality of the leader, right? We want to ask the question, how did the government or the leader view the people? And when they looked at the people, what did they see? During the conversation between Duke Chen Huai and the king of Wu in 494 BC, the duke said, "I have heard that a country is prosperous and strong because it treats its people tenderly as if they were injured. This is indeed the country's good fortune. On the other hand, a country is in ruin because it tramples on its people as if they were mud or grass under its feet. This is indeed disastrous for the country. Now, I think this is an extremely delicate description from the lens of the leaders and really brings out the mentality of the leader. For example, if we were injured, we must be very careful with the wound, right? And try everything we can to protect it and heal it. Now, if you observe the way that a parent holds an infant, is almost as if the person is holding a fragile artwork. So the infant is well protected and healthy. Likewise, when a good leader looks at the life of the people, it's like treating his own injury. He feels the pain of the people, and everything his government does is to improve the people's situation. So this is the mentality of a good leader. And in this case, the country is very likely to thrive. But in contrast, a bad leader would treat the people like mud and grass. Well, what is the characteristic of mud and grass? Well, they're plenty in quantity, and they don't have much of a value, do they? So when you need them to support you, you use them, and when you don't need them anymore, you would hardly think of them. So if a leader treats the people like mud and grass, then there is no way for the leader to work for the people. He will not address the people's concern. I mean, why would he, right? Unless it is for the leader's own benefit. So if this is the case, the country is very likely to fall. Now, this analogy and argument has been tested and proved again and again throughout the history. It is also the basis of Mencius' famous assertion that the people are the most important, the state is the next, the ruler is the least. Right? We have mentioned this before. Now, this principle can also be applied in the operation of private enterprises. In private enterprise, there are various stakeholders, right? Such as employees, directors, capital providers, which are shareholders, etc. And although the company would not run without any of the stakeholders, employees are fundamental to the survival of the company from an operational perspective. Why? Well, employees are at the front line of business interaction with the rest of the economy, including customers, suppliers, regulators, researchers, and media, etc. They are the ones who convert high-level strategies into actions. So at work, employees may encounter various problems that prevent them from performing well, such as work-life balance, health issue, and mental stress, etc. So the management team must treat the employees as their own injury and see these problems as their own problems. Only this way can the management team come up with targeted solution to help the employees. And when the employees feel that they are valued and taken care of, they will be willing to give 100% to the company, and so as to benefit the shareholders and management team. Only then, right, can the company consider the technical part of business management, such as expansion and investment. Because without the support of the employees, the business plan will not be well executed. In addition, during the execution of the business plan, many things can go wrong, and a lot of problems must be solved quickly on the spot. So it is impractical to rely on the management team for everything. This requires the employees to be highly motivated and take personal ownership of the problem and come up with solutions. So again, this points to the need of valuing the employees. Now, we have seen many successful companies in the world that emphasize on employee welfare and have achieved very good financial results. And these are not limited to certain high-tech companies which seem to rely more on personal innovation and personal flexibility, but also include traditional manufacturing companies. In fact, the ancient Chinese governing principles, or Confucius philosophy in particular, have been successfully adopted by many well-known businesses. And if we examine the secret, is always about the good relationship between the management and the employees. For example, during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, many of the private businesses in the Asian market went bankrupt, and many companies ran into cash flow problems and couldn't pay out salaries. There were many examples, many cases where employees went on strike and complained about the salary. Although it is understandable, this would put the company under more stress and threaten the survival of the companies. In contrast, many employees of South Korean companies did not do that. And what is more, they took out some of their own savings, their family savings, and helped the companies to stay alive during the crisis. And some of the employees said to the business owners, they said, we've been able to live off stable income and support our family for decades because of you. Now our company is in danger. We want to work with you and get through this difficult time. Without the company, we will not have a job, and you can always pay us back after the business returns to normal. So clearly, you see, this sort of reaction would only happen when there is a good leader-employee relation. But more specifically, it is conditional on whether or not the leader can treat the employees with kindness. The help provided by the employees when the business is in danger is a natural response, isn't it? Which is in line with the principle of reciprocity. We can find many examples in Japanese businesses as well. For example, the Japanese business giant Inamori Kazuo, who was the founder of the Japanese telecommunication operator KDDI, and he was also the CEO of Japan Airline. He applied traditional Chinese ethics into his management philosophy. Also, the founder of Panasonic, Matsushita Kosuke, put the governing principles into business management. Now, we have a very interesting and enlightening story about Matsushita's interaction with one of his employees. Okay, so Matsushita's business operated many factories. Okay, and one day, one of the factory managers didn't come to work. And by coincidence, the factory was caught on fire on that day and incurred huge loss to the company. So it wouldn't be surprising if this factory manager was under heavy fire and questioning, right? However, Matsushita didn't blame the manager straight away, but investigated why he wasn't at work on that day. And it turned out that this manager's mother was badly ill and was hospitalized, and he needed to see his mother at the hospital. He was a very good and filial son, but it was very unfortunate that the factory was caught on fire on that day. So upon knowing this, Matsushita bought a gift and came to pay visit to his mother. And he also said to the manager reassuringly that, well, it is my fault that I have no knowledge about your mother's condition, and I have not been paying enough attention to my employees. He also said, you should now take care of your mother and worry about the business after she recovers. So after the manager returned to the company upon his mother's recovery, Matsushita didn't penalize him. Instead, he knew that he had always been a diligent employee, and he was simply fulfilling his filial duty to someone he owed the greatest debt, which was, of course, his mother. So there's nothing wrong about that. So subsequently, Matsushita transferred this manager to a different function, but also given him a great responsibility. So this way, the manager could avoid the questioning from other colleagues while being able to maintain his job. And the result was the manager fully appreciated Matsushita's kind intention, and in return, he worked wholeheartedly for the company. Confucianism talks about the causal relationship between a caring leader and the loyalty of the subordinates. But this relationship starts from the leader first. There is a start here, right? If we think about this, Matsushita would not do something like this if he didn't treat the employee as precious or as his injury. And because of his caring attitude towards the employees, Matsushita won the heart of the employees and, of course, a thriving business. Now, the attitude of the leader towards the people is also driven by what is called the triple roles of the leader. The triple roles, which are the king, which is a leader, the parent, and the teacher. So these roles are not explicitly stated in the job description, of course, but they underpins the relationship between the good leader and the people. So let me explain this. The first role, the king. Now, in the past, kings made the final decision. And in modern society, it is not one person at the top, but the government as a whole that makes a final decision for the people. The government plays a significant role in setting the tone of the direction of major economic policies, for example. In traditional Chinese culture, one requirement on the ruling body is that it must be very careful with what it says. We say that the king makes no joke. Right? This is how the government establishes credibility. You see, there's no way that the government says one thing today and says the other tomorrow. And this means that the government must be extremely careful with the message that it conveys because it bears credibility. The king, or the government, the ruler, or whatever the name is, the ruling body always leads the way for the people. So economic and social policies that go along with human nature and ethics will lead to prosperity. Otherwise, disasters will follow. So that was the first role. The second role of the government is to act as the parent of the people. In Chinese, we call the officials a parent governor, right? Literally, a parent governor. And that shows the kind of intimacy. So the governor and the governed are not enemies. The government think about what the people need, what they worry about in their lives, and what they like in their life. And the government protect the people and nourish the people. Of course, it takes a lot, right, to put that into practice. But so does parenting, isn't it? How the government think about the people is important. It's like the difference between, thinking for your own children and thinking for somebody else's children. Well, I mean, it sounds cruel, but probably true. That we tend to think more thoroughly and responsibly for our own children, right? Now, the third role for the government is to act as the teacher of the people. Now, I think in modern society, this notion might seem odd and may receive immediate resistance. I mean, after all, not even the real teachers at school or universities receive proper respect these days. However, this role does not entail the simple and naive scenario where, government officials tell people what to do. This role means that the leader has the responsibility of teaching the people about the value of life and ethics. The only way for the people to be willing to accept the teaching is that the leader must practice virtue and ethics first, as we said before. And with such a leader or teacher, the people will naturally follow. So to demonstrate our point here to our viewers, let's have a look at one of the historic records in the governing principles. It's about the three alternative styles of governance. Okay, three different styles of governance, and each style has different result. If you remember the governor Zhi from, I think, the previous lecture, right? Zhi, his governing style is based on righteousness and also very stringent law and regulation. So it's documented that the people was unable to cheat the government. Okay, remember this phrase. The people was unable to cheat the government, and the word cheat simply represent any activity that dodges the law or takes advantage of loopholes. and Zhi regulation was quite complete, so the people just simply couldn't play with the law, and this is one of the styles of governance. Another style is called afraid to cheat. Okay, afraid to cheat. And this means that the punishment is so harsh and the cost of breaking the law is so great that people don't want to break the law. So this is more about the psychological deterrent. And this was the method used by the governor called Xi Bao. Well, also very effective, but in a different way. The third style is called unwilling to cheat. Unwilling. And this is about the story of Zhi, okay, who was one of Confucius' students. When Zhi governed the city of Shanfu, he used the method of benevolence. And clearly he applied his master's governing principles, right? So the people under his governance were simply unwilling to cheat the law because they always remember the kindness of Zhi. And the governance was very successful and efficient. So it drew the attention of another student of Confucius called II.1 A. Okay, so one day II.1 A decided to come over and verify in secret just how well the governance was. So one evening, he came to Shanfu, and he saw an old fisherman who caught a fish in the river, but immediately threw the fish back into the river. So II.1 A was, puzzled by his action and asked him why he did so. The fisherman replied, well, the governor asked us to only catch large fish and preserve the smaller fish in the river because these fish, they're still growing. Now, remember this happened at night, right? And nobody was watching. So II.1 A was very impressed and reported back to Confucius. He said to the master, Zhi's benevolent governance has reached a very high level. The people in Shanfu is highly self-disciplined, and they require themselves to obey the law as if they were being watched. In Chinese language, there is a word for this kind of situation called cautious while alone. Okay, so this is quite an achievement. Confucius explained this, that this is made possible only because Zhi is extremely sincere and benevolent in his governance. And this has a profound impact on the people. The people are moved by Zhi's virtue, and they were simply unwilling to disappoint him by breaking the law. So if I ask our viewers which of the three styles is the best, I guess the answer is quite obvious. right? And again, the response of the people is conditional on the attitude of the leader towards the people. With the right attitude and a sincere mindset, a good governance is indeed not a mission impossible. Now, let's have a look at the second dimension of leaders' attitude, okay? And that's the attitude towards his own cultivation. Now, self-cultivation is not just about the acquisition of knowledge and university degree, but also improvement of personal characteristics and ethical standard. If we think about the time and resolution it takes to improve personal characteristics, is much harder than knowledge acquisition. And this is because in improving personal characteristics, we have to constantly combat against our habit, including greed, hatred, arrogance, doubt, and selfishness, etc. You see, we all want to be great, don't we? And sometimes we're fully aware of our weakness and where we should be working on. But on the journey of self-cultivation, we just find it easy to slip back to our comfort zone. And this shows the importance of self-cultivation. The greater the difficulty, the greater the reward. In fact, a correct attitude towards self-cultivation is the basis for anyone who wants to succeed in any profession. For example, for a student who wants to succeed academically, before he starts learning the knowledge, he must learn to respect the teacher. And as we discussed before in the previous lecture, the attitude of respect is not only ethical, but will also generate a high level of concentration, leading to a better learning outcome. Also, for an athlete who wants to succeed in a sports career, he must improve his mental endurance and perseverance. When many of the great athletes explain their success stories and trainings, they often emphasize solely on their mental strength instead of congenital advantages. The same applies to the leader of a country, even more so, because the leader's attitude towards self-cultivation also influences the rest of the government and the people. So self-cultivation and self-indulgence can lead to a very different result, right, of governance. A leader starting with low qualification but highly motivated to self-cultivate will achieve far greater result than a leader starting with hereditary advantage but no cultivation. We can certainly compare the life between two leaders in ancient Chinese history, Emperor Taizong of Tang Dynasty and King Zhou of Shang Dynasty. Now, as we may recall from the introduction of this course, before Taizong became the emperor, he was in the military with his father from the age of 16, right? Now, because of his early military career, he had very little time to read about the ancient classics and study any of the governing principles. After the last emperor of Sui Dynasty was overthrown, his father became the first emperor of Tang Dynasty in around 618 AD, and he was succeeded by Taizong 8 years later. Many people know that his reign became regarded as the exemplary model against which all future emperors were measured. His era, which is known as the reign of Zheng Guan, is considered a golden age in ancient Chinese history, and was treated as required studying material for future crown princes. However, this achievement didn't happen effortlessly. After Taizong ascended to the throne, he quickly realized that, a dynasty can easily disappear if the governing was not performed correctly. And it is clear that the failure of Sui Dynasty made a huge impression on Taizong. So for this reason, he assembled some of his most knowledgeable and ethically superior ministers and asked them to compile the governing principles from all of the ancient classics and texts. And Taizong is also known to be extremely humble in learning, and he never let the books of governing principles leaving his sight. He said, "I have never seen such elegant teaching of governance. It allows me to generate the most appropriate solutions in the face of problems." You can see that his attitude towards self-cultivation is also reflected in his appointment of certain ministers, right? As we said before, their only job was to follow the emperor everywhere he went and to record his mistakes, from his speech-making to the thing he did. He would then reflect upon these mistakes. Even if someone criticized him incorrectly, he would not stop the criticism because he was afraid that it would discourage criticism in the future. Taizong welcomed criticism because he viewed it as a shortcut of self-cultivation. Now, there are also quite a few examples from the opposite side. Okay, now one of them is King Zhou of Shang. So, King Zhou was the last king of Shang dynasty, and I think you can probably guess why, right? The last king of a failing dynasty usually failed in self-cultivation to begin with. And in fact, King Zhou was not an incapable person at all. And he had many talents and was physically strong as well. He also made great contribution in agricultural development. However, he was also known for his cruel governing style. During the later part of his reign, he indulged himself in music, in luxuries, art, and women, and ignoring his responsibility. When the ministers came to him to give advice, he rejected them. The ministers would also find themselves in a dangerous situation if they complained to the king too much. And King Zhou killed those ministers who advised him to change his behavior, and even his own uncle. Eventually, the empire was lost in a coup, and nobody came for the rescue. And the king had no other way to escape from his failure and committed suicide. If we, treat the history as a database, right, then the rise and fall of kings and rulers are the empirical tests of the governing principles or governing theories. In volume 39 of the governing principles, it records a set of traits of failing rulers, personal traits. Those who fail the country usually have enormous self-pride, and they think of themselves as intelligent and smart. Meanwhile, they're also arrogant. This makes their actions imperious. When they're offered tough advice, it is against their self-esteem, so that they reject it regardless. However, none of this prevents the real threat from arriving, and when it does, the arrogant rulers have neither prepared themselves with response, nor are they protected by people's support. This is how a government fails. The governing principles say that self-cultivation is not only an ethical practice, but also a practical firewall to prevent the above problems. You see, the country doesn't fail because it lacks of abundant resources. It doesn't fail because it is poor. It doesn't fail because it is robbed by foreign invaders. None of those can bring down a country, as long as the ruling body improves itself and cultivates its moral characteristics. Now, there are many aspects of self-cultivation, but we just want to build on our earlier discussion and comparison and discuss 2 points. Okay, the first is the leader's attitude towards the criticism, which is from the outside, and the other is the attitude towards personal desire, which is inside, or internal. Okay. Now, we mentioned Emperor Taizong welcomed criticism, and he even established a specific post to raise criticism from within his government. This particular personal trait is not only found in Emperor Taizong, but also in many great leaders. The benefit about welcoming criticism is, of course, not for projecting a positive image of the government. Is not to showcase the openness of the government or the leader. Right? The purpose is to reduce the mistakes over time so that good fortune can naturally arrive. Of course, not all criticisms are necessarily accurate or correct. And this may be caused by inaccurate information, the stickiness of certain ideology, and impracticality, etc. So when this happens, a government would have to evaluate the criticism and only act upon the ones that are truly useful. But overall, criticism can be viewed as a shortcut to successful governance because it saves the government from making fatal mistakes and prevent the disasters from materializing. Therefore, it is important for the ruler to have a correct mindset about criticism, right? He should welcome the criticism even if some of them are inappropriate. He should also appreciate harsh advice because harsh advice may point out some of the hidden problems in governance. In contrast, a leader who brings chaos enjoys his name to be glorified, right? He loves it, or she, of course. And he doesn't think much about the authenticity of his fame. And he cannot distinguish between true fame and flattering comments. A leader who, I guess, enjoys fame more than anything else is very unlikely to hear any valuable comments. Now, firstly, this is because he doesn't want to hear them. And secondly, his ministers don't want to put themselves in an awkward situation by advising such leader. Consequently, the leader gradually falls into a self-generated delusion of perfection, and his mistakes will be left undetected and will accumulate. So, in any event, I suppose this is detrimental, not only to the leader's own virtue, but also to the country. Apart from the contrasting examples of Emperor Taizong and King Zhou of Shang, there are many examples in ancient Chinese history that prove again and again the relationship between leaders' attitude towards criticism, both right and wrong, and the fate of the country. Now, apart from external criticism, how the leader deals with internal desire also has important governance consequence. The governing principles use the example of the boom and the bust of Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasty to illustrate this particular point. And for each respective dynasty, the country was well governed when the rulers restrained their desires. And when they did not, the society fell. And in the worst case, the family in power was completely replaced. So no country prospers forever, right? Unless there is a constant check on the leader's self-control. But what we have talked about is empirical discovery. It's a pattern, right? Now, we need to ask why the leader's self-control is so important. I think this deserves more explanation. The Book of Rites, the chapter of the Great Learning, outlines the process through which good governance is achieved. it doesn't start with economic policy or legal reform or anything like that. Instead, it starts with the control of desire. Now, let's think about the definition of desire. Well, what is it? Well, desire is, by nature, is endless. When we fulfill one desire, our feeling of contentment only exists for a limited amount of time. And after that, our attention is attracted by other desires. So with a good control over desire, our mind will obtain stability. And only by keeping desire under control can we gradually make our mind still. Now, what is the benefit of achieving stillness and stability of the mind then? Well, it reveals what is called the innate wisdom. The innate wisdom. You see, wisdom is not the same as knowledge, right? Well, knowledge is acquired externally. Wisdom is what we are naturally born with. However, sometimes we simply cannot get access to our innate wisdom because our mind is too busy chasing desires. So with wisdom being revealed, a person is able to see through complex issues and distinguish between right and wrong. Now you might wonder, oh, wait a minute, I'm 40 years of age, I know what is right, I know what is wrong. But think again. Sometimes our judgment changes dramatically, doesn't it? Depending on our mood, our mentality, information, or even the time of the day. So let's take an investment as an example. Okay, in performing investment analysis, people must be rational and evidence-based. After extensive analysis, people finally come up with a set of conclusion that is objective and credible. However, the market is not always stable, right? And there can be external shocks, like the pandemic, for instance. Not only that, the market can be flooded with by people's opinions. And these opinions are not independent, but they affect each other. So when the analyst faces this flood of public opinions, he must be able to maintain rationality and assess the credibility of the opinions and adjust his investment decision only when necessary. Now, if he concludes that the opinions are not credible, then he must maintain his ground and keep his investment decision steady. However, most people are unfortunately influenced by public opinion. They change their mind not because they have any evidence or understanding of what's happening, but simply because of the built-in human flaw. We call it herding. And most importantly, people cannot distinguish between rational decision-making and behavioral bias. So for this reason, people may not be able to distinguish right and wrong on certain complex issues. This is especially the case when the majority of the population hold similar view, and it takes enormous amounts of courage and wisdom to do the right thing. The Great Learning explains that once a person has reclaimed wisdom and is able to do things correctly, he can manage his family well. Well, you see, family is an organization that is no less complicated than a company or institution. And there are many, interactive relationships in a family. Different family members have various responsibilities as well. In ancient China, the size of a family can be in several hundreds, so it does require a lot of wisdom to manage a family. Governing a state is the same as governing a family in principle, only, of course, more complex. So ultimately, good governance can bring harmony to all the countries in the world and achieve world peace. So if we stand back, right, and consider this process in Great Learning, we can see that the control of one's desire is not at all a minor issue. This is particularly the case for the leader of a country. For a leader, controlling desire is not only a virtue but also a responsibility. Why? Well, this leads to our discussion of the deeper meaning of controlling desire. Okay? Now, for the leader of a country, the biggest question to ask is, who do I work for? For myself or the world? This question comes from a very important passage in the governing principles, and I would like to read this out for you in its entirety. It says, almost 1,000 years have passed since the heyday of King Cheng and King Kang of Zhou, and many rulers having tried to attain the same glory, but this golden era of peace and prosperity never returned. Why has this been so? It is because rulers have forsaken the law and moral standards and have instead pursued selfish desires, spoiling themselves with extravagance and totally neglecting the practice of benevolence and righteousness. This passage is recorded in the book of Han, and is part of the writing of Ban Gu. Okay, Ban Gu was one of the great historian of the Eastern Han Dynasty. Now, the most important takeaway is the purpose and the correct mindset of the leader, right? When a leader works to maximize his private benefit, he would abandon benevolence and righteousness. Although he or she might be able to reap some benefit in the short term, it is impossible to achieve the long-term prosperity for the country. Therefore, when we're trying to make a judgment about a leader or whether or not he is the right person for the job, we must investigate his heart. Sometimes a person who seems to be tough and ambitious is actually working for the greater good, while a seemingly selfless and righteous person may be driven by his or her own selfish agenda. In volume 36 of the governing principles, it documents a short passage which reveals the different features of the rulers that lead to different outcomes of the country. And this may be useful for us to improve our understanding of the quality of the leader and shed some light on the fate of the country. Now, based on historical observation, the leaders and the ministers of a failing era often care about the benefit of their job. When they consider their career plans, they often think about which position is the most lucrative, most beneficial, and which role has the best career opportunity. Now we can imagine, right, with a benefit-driven mentality like this, the decision made by the leaders or ministers are very likely to be biased and suboptimal. An action that is beneficial to the country but not beneficial to the leader himself may not be executed. But if the leader is selfless and is driven by bringing benefit to the world, then his decision and action, although not necessarily perfect at all times, will largely be in line with the benefit of the country in the right direction. So this also shows that when we are trying to understand the performance of a government or an individual official, it's important to observe what they do in the long term, not what they say in the short term. It's also important to analyze their performance in a rational manner, right? Without falling into the behavioral trap such as herding. Now, the final dimension of the leader's attitude is the attitude towards his HR policy, okay, human resource policy. Now, we mentioned in a previous lecture that political structure is only a channel. Political structure is only a channel through which a country is governed. And as compared to the structure, the persons who operate the system have far more influence over the outcome. So this points to the importance for the government to recruit suitable officials to take up suitable responsibilities. In other words, the government should spend sufficient resources to improve its human capital. Now, because this is the core of governance, this is also one of the most controversial areas of government work. When the leader finds it challenging to achieve the governor's objectives, okay, one of the usual points of complaint is that there is a general lacking of human capital and talented officials. Now, although this is an easy blame, isn't it? This is an easy blame. The governing principles provide theories and evidence that suggest otherwise. Instead of having inferior human capital, which might be true, it is more likely the case that there is a mismatch between the government official's talent and the way his talent is utilized. For example, volume 46 of the governing principles suggests two potential cases. One is that the government does have talented officials in place, but they're simply not used. They're idle, essentially. And they may have a job in the government, but the job doesn't fully reflect his skill. It's like asking a PhD in quantum physics to work as a tour guide, right? And number two, the official may be placed in the right position and has given valuable advice to the leader, but the advice is never adopted. And this may be caused by the objections coming from certain interest groups who act selfishly, or the leader simply cannot see the value of the advice. But in any event, we cannot say that there is no human capital. Now, let me emphasize this point again, if I may. Although the result is the same, understanding the cause of the problem is absolutely crucial. This is because complaining about the lacking of talent makes the underperformance nobody's problem, right? In theory, no one should be blamed for something that is out of their control, and this is a perfect excuse when things go wrong. History suggests that there are always loyal and talented officials within the reach of the leaders. But when the leaders ignore them or punish them for being overly direct or giving harsh advice, the leader will be soon surrounded by treacherous officials. And this would make this would mark the beginning of the end of a country, doesn't it? This is exactly what happened during the dying days of Xia dynasty. As you probably remember, Xia dynasty began with Emperor Yu, who was a benevolent and virtuous leader who treated the people as his own children and his own injury. But when it came to the ruling of Jie, he took nobody's advice. For example, one of Jie's advisor, Guan Longfeng, objected to Jie's luxurious lifestyle as a king. He showed his objection by standing beside Jie and never leaving his side. So Jie became so annoyed and executed Guan Longfeng. Eventually, Jie was only surrounded by flattering officials who gave absolutely no useful advice, and as you can imagine, his ruling came to an end very quickly. Very similar fate, happened to the very last king of Shang Dynasty, King Zhou, so we won't repeat it here now. Now, when thinking about the governing principles, it's always very important to observe the rise and fall of different regimes. And there is a reason why some countries or administrations are able to maintain law and order or reduce social disruption quickly, while some others face prolonged chaos. The governing principles emphasize that the root cause is the virtue and ethical standard of the government officials. If the government allows treacherous and slanderous people to interfere the administration, disasters will follow. This is because these officials usually work for their own benefit, which is obviously at odds with the benefit of the greater society. Now, I think we have said quite enough about the relative importance of human capital in government's work. So the big question is, how should the government identify and use the talent properly? Well, this is the focus of the next 4 lectures. Now, we're not going to discuss further for today, but what we can say now is that human resource is a deep social science. We call it science because it requires logic and doesn't allow for any emotional bias to interfere. Sometimes when we look at a person, and may think that he or she is very intelligent, very wise, and extremely loyal, while some others appear to be foolish. But these appearances may be delusive, and it takes some serious skills to really understand somebody. And it is obviously not a terribly serious issue in day-to-day life, and we don't want to be too critical on people. But when it comes to government human resource management and the selection of the officials or leader, then it becomes extremely important because the rest of the country depends on the government. This is true under any social and political structure. So that's it for today, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.